Eduardo walked slowly through the city park, his hands in his pockets and his thoughts elsewhere. It was a peaceful afternoon, the kind where the wind blows gently and the scent of flowers seems stronger than usual. The sun was hiding behind the trees, painting the sky golden. He liked that place. There was something nostalgic about that wooden bench where he always sat, as if he could talk to time there. But that afternoon, something different happened. As he watched the people passing by, couples smiling, children playing tag, old men chatting, Eduardo's eyes stopped on a scene that made his heart race. On the other side of the park, between the trees, he saw a woman pushing a baby carriage. Beside her, two boys were running after a ball, laughing loudly, as if there weren't a care in the world. But it wasn't the boys' joy that caught his attention. It was her, Clara. His heart skipped a beat, so hard he almost lost his balance. 15 years. 15 years since the last time he looked into her eyes. And even after so much time, he recognized her immediately. The way she walked, her carelessly tied hair, her serene gaze. It was impossible to mistake her. Clara was there, before him, like a ghost from the past. Only alive, real, smiling. And with 3 children. Eduardo felt his entire body freeze. Clara? With children? His mind became a whirlwind. What was that? Throughout their marriage, they had tried, cried, prayed, but they had failed. The doctors had been clear: infertility. It had been years of shattered hopes and sleepless nights. And now, there in front of him, Clara seemed to have formed the family they had dreamed of together, but without him. He remained standing, hidden behind a bush, not daring to approach her. He just watched. The boys laughed, the youngest pointed at the birds in the sky, and Clara picked him up in her arms with a caress that Eduardo knew well. A silent pain invaded his chest. It was as if he had entered a film where the protagonist had been replaced, and all that was left was the role of spectator. Why now? Why with her? And why without me? He thought, feeling his chest tighten. The past he was trying to leave behind was there before his eyes, and it seemed more alive than ever. Eduardo was still standing there, trying to understand how his ex-wife, who had once cried by his side because she couldn't get pregnant, was now there with 3 children. His mind, no matter how much he fought against it, was pulled back in time, as if each step Clara took in that park activated a hidden memory. It was impossible to forget the beginning of everything. They met at a conference on sustainability in a small coastal town called Campo Verde. He was an architect, passionate about creative and functional constructions. She was a biology teacher, fascinated by life's little discoveries. Clara approached the model of an ecological building he was showing and asked, "Does this collect rainwater?" And that was when the first smile between them was born. The conversation that started out technical turned into laughter, and by the end of the night, they were already making plans to see each other again. Their courtship was quick, intense. Soon they were living together, laughing at how they decorated the apartment with crooked pictures and little plants that she insisted on taking care of even when they died. Everything was light. Everything had shine. They talked about children as if they were talking about a certain future. They planned names, sketched out the children's rooms, and imagined Sundays filled with chaos and laughter. But the months passed, and nothing. At first, they tried not to worry. "It's just anxiety," they said. But the pregnancy tests continued to be negative, and the appointments began. Tears hidden in the bathroom. Silences that took over the house. Clara spent sleepless nights, and Eduardo pretended to be asleep just so as not to make her even more distressed. The two, who had been so close before, began to drift apart in silence. The pain was shared, but each suffered in their own way. The test came with cold terms, confusing diagnoses. And one day, the doctor said in a tone that hurt more than any words, "The chances are minimal." That was like a sentence. Clara tried to keep hope alive, suggested treatments, and talked about adoption. Eduardo, deep down, was drowning in a feeling of failure. He felt powerless, as if he had failed as a man, as a husband. The arguments began to appear in the details: a forgotten coffee, a poorly washed piece of clothing, an absence of words. They didn't fight badly. They just stopped understanding each other. and the love that once overflowed began to fit into an empty, silent room where her crying echoed without consolation. Until one day, she simply said, "I can't live in this waiting anymore." And he, silently, agreed with her look. The divorce came as an announced end. But Eduardo never forgot. Neither did Clara, nor did the dream. And now, this dream seemed to have come alive, right there before his eyes. The day Eduardo left that apartment still seemed fresh in his mind, as if it had happened last week. He remembered every detail, the smell of the coffee Clara had made, even without drinking a drop, the bags packed without fighting, without scandal, the glances exchanged, full of sadness, but empty of hope, and the silence that said everything that words could no longer express. They didn't hate each other, and maybe that made everything even harder. Because when love leaves with shouts, it's easier to accept that it's over. But when it leaves quietly, without slamming the door, the pain remains. And it stays for a long time. Eduardo didn't hear from her again after the breakup. He blocked her on social media, deleted her number. Not out of anger, but out of fear. Fear of seeing her move on. Fear of no longer being part of her life. Fear that she would find what he couldn't give her. In the following months, he tried to keep himself busy with work. New projects, meetings, trips. On the outside, everything seemed fine. On the inside, every baby he saw on the street, every nursery in a store was a silent stab. He would come home and lie down on the couch, staring at the ceiling and asking himself what he had done wrong. Why had fate been so cruel to two people who loved each other so much? And Clara, well, he didn't know anything. He didn't want to know. But around every corner, in every dream, she appeared. Sometimes smiling, sometimes crying, sometimes with a baby in her arms that he had never met. Time passed. Years, actually. And Eduardo, despite having tried new relationships, was never able to give his heart in the same way. Something always pulled him back to the past, to that small apartment, to the little plants on the balcony, to the conversations about names of children that never came. Now, standing in that park, seeing Clara with 3 children, it was as if time had come back with full force. As if all those years of silence were screaming at the same time. She seemed fine, happy, at peace, and that, as contradictory as it seemed, hurt. Has she moved on with someone? Has she found a new love? Has she adopted? Has she undergone treatment? Has she remarried? The questions invaded his mind like waves in a rough sea. And the biggest of all was, why did she never tell him anything? Eduardo sat on the same bench, as always, his hands shaking, his heart racing. On the other side, Clara was helping her youngest son up the slide, while the other 2 played ball further ahead. He didn't know what to do. But one thing was certain, that story wasn't over yet. Eduardo spent almost 20 minutes there, motionless on that bench, as if time had frozen around him. Everything seemed to be in slow motion. The swing going back and forth, the youngest boy laughing out loud, the other 2 running after the ball with the energy typical of someone who still doesn't know what pain is. And Clara seemed complete, as if she had won a long battle that he didn't even know she had fought. But inside, Eduardo was a walking mess. He leaned forward, as if he were going to get up and go to her, but something was pulling him back. Fear, shame, guilt. He felt as if invading that moment would be disrespecting a happiness she had built without him. But at the same time, the desire to understand burned in his chest. Are they her children? His? Did she adopt them? Did she marry someone and start a family? What if they are mine? Is that possible? Have we stopped trying? But did she try again alone? Each hypothesis seemed more absurd than the last. But the silence of time made everything seem possible. Eduardo wondered if he had the right to appear now, so many years later, full of questions, when perhaps Clara no longer expected anything from him. But what if she had waited? What if she had, somehow, wanted him to be there? To see all that? To understand? It didn't make sense. But neither did that pain. He closed his eyes for a few seconds and felt the wind touch his face, as if life itself was trying to calm him. He remembered a long-ago night when Clara was crying in the bathroom with the lights off, thinking he couldn't hear her. But he could hear her, and it hurt. He just didn't know how to heal her, or how to heal himself. Does she still feel angry with me? He thought. Hot tears began to form, but he held them back. He didn't want to seem weak, even if no one was watching. Pride had always been a heavy armor, but at that moment, it was all he had. Then, as if by default, he picked up his cell phone and started searching for an old contact. A mutual friend, someone who knew about Clara. He stopped at a name, Tiago. They had lost contact, but Tiago had always been close to both of them. He sent a short, almost hesitant message. Do you know if Clara got married? New? He stared at the screen, waiting for the 3 dots to appear. Nothing. His heart was beating fast, his hands were sweating. He needed to know, but he was afraid of the answer, and even more afraid of the silence. On the other side of the park, Clara was calling the boys to leave. Eduardo felt a tightness, as if time was running out. If he didn't do something now, he might never have another chance. But was he ready? Because the truth is that he didn't just want to know about the children. He wanted answers that time didn't provide. He wanted to understand if there was still space, or if all that was left was a page turned without him. Tiago's answer only arrived the next day. Eduardo had spent the night awake, tossing and turning in bed, rewatching every scene from the park as if he were watching a movie he didn't remember being in. His cell phone vibrated at 7:43 a.m., and he practically jumped out of bed. Tiago, hi, Edu. Dude, it's been a while, hasn't it? About Clara. Yes, she has 3 children. She lives near me in a simpler neighborhood, but I don't think she's going to get married. At least I've never seen anyone with her. Eduardo stared at that message for a few seconds. 3 children. She didn't get married. Both pieces of information were pounding like drums inside his head. He picked up his cell phone again and answered almost without thinking. And the father? Do you know who the children's father is? This time, the answer took a little longer. Eduardo went for a walk while he waited. He couldn't stand being locked up in his own apartment any longer, suffocated by walls that only echoed questions. He walked through the neighborhood streets as if his footsteps would ease his anguish. He only stopped when his cell phone vibrated again. Tiago. So that's a mystery. She's never talked about the boy's father. Whenever someone asks, she changes the subject. She says that life took her down different paths and that she'd rather not talk about it. But they all have her last name. None of them have the father's. That felt like a weight in his stomach. Eduardo sat down on the first bench he saw on the sidewalk and rested his elbows on his knees, burying his head in his hands. It was as if each new answer brought more questions. Do they all have her last name and none of her father's? What if that idea began to grow like a poison seed? What if, after the separation, Clara had tried one last time with the embryos that were still frozen at the fertility clinic? They had talked about it one day, when they were still together, about the possibility of saving the embryos. What if one day, she would say, but they never brought it up again? Especially because after the divorce, he thought everything had been ruled out. But what if she had gone alone? What if those boys were his children? The world spun for a moment. Eduardo took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and tried to anchor himself in reality. It seemed absurd, but Clara had always had a silent strength, a determination that appeared at the most unexpected moments. If she had decided to be a mother, even alone, he had no doubt that she would have gone all the way. Does she owe me an explanation? He thought. Or was it he who owed it? That afternoon, Eduardo called Tiago and asked to meet up. They sat in an old cafe in the city where they used to chat back in college. The smell of toasted bread and freshly brewed coffee seemed the same as it had been years ago. Dude, Eduardo said, running his hands over his face. Do you think I should look for Clara? Tiago took a sip of his coffee, thought for a moment, and answered with the sincerity of someone who isn't afraid to hurt someone. The question isn't whether you should, the question is whether you're prepared for what you might hear. Eduardo swallowed hard, because deep down he didn't know. 2 days later, Eduardo decided that there was no way to run away anymore. He wasn't sleeping well, he couldn't concentrate on his work, and Clara's face, along with the children's smiles, kept coming back to him wherever he went, even in the middle of traffic. It was as if something was pushing him, as if life was saying, go ahead and face it once and for all. He got Clara's old number from Tiago. To his surprise, it was still the same. She spent more than an hour staring at her cell phone screen, writing and deleting messages, until she finally sent it. "Hi, Clara. This is Eduardo. Can we talk?" She saw it a few minutes later. She didn't respond right away. Eduardo felt his heart race. Was she angry? Would she ignore him? But half an hour later, the reply arrived. "Yes, we can. Tomorrow, at 5 p.m. at Café de Praca." That was it. Direct. No beating around the bush. Just like she always was. The next day, Eduardo arrived early. He sat at a table near the window, where he could see the movement of the street and the people coming and going. His hands were sweating. His heart was beating as if it were about to burst out his chest. When Clara came in, he felt his breath leave him for a few seconds. She was wearing a simple blouse and jeans. Her hair, shorter than he remembered, had a few frizz, discreet white strands. But the shine in her eyes was the same. That sweet, steady look that he never forgot. "Hi, Eduardo," she said, sitting across from him with a calm but closed expression. "Hi, Clara. Thanks for coming." An awkward silence followed. It wasn't hostile, but it was charged, as if they were both treading on delicate territory. Eduardo looked at her hands on the table, her fingers intertwined, and realized that she was nervous too, although she tried to hide it. He began, hesitating. "I saw you in the park the other day." Clara just nodded. "I imagined. And I saw the boys. The youngest called you Mom." His voice trailed off for a second. "I was confused, Clara. Really confused." She took a deep breath. "I understand. But you came all the way here to ask, didn't you?" "Yes. I needed to hear it from you." She then picked up the cup of coffee the waitress had left a moment ago, took a sip, and looked at him firmly. "The boys are mine, Eduardo. 2 of them, Caio and Davi, are biological children. And yes, they're yours too." Eduardo felt the world stop. The ground seemed to have disappeared beneath his feet. "What?" he whispered, his eyes wide. "They are mine?" Clara nodded, without lowering her gaze. "Remember the frozen embryos? After the divorce, I decided to try. Alone. And it worked. I became a mother." Eduardo didn't know what to say. The words got mixed up in his mouth. He only felt his chest exploding inside. Joy, shock, guilt, longing. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" "Because I didn't know if you wanted to be a part of it. Because I was tired of waiting for answers, for someone who had left." Silence reigned again. But this time it was different. It was the silence of 2 people who carried too many stories inside their chests, and who perhaps, only now, were beginning to make room to start over. Eduardo remained silent. He stared at Clara, but seemed to see everything except what was in front of him. Inside, a whirlwind. It was as if a part of him wanted to get up, run away, scream, and another just wanted to cry right there in that cramped cafe with the smell of sweet bread and old memories. "I can't believe it," he finally murmured. "They're mine, ours. And I didn't even know." Clara let out her breath slowly, as if she had been waiting for that reaction. "I thought a lot about whether I should tell you," she said. "But at the time, everything was so broken between us. I didn't know if you wanted to know, or if it would be good for them." Eduardo ran his hand through his hair, trying to organize himself mentally. "But I had the right to know, Clara. They're my children too. You couldn't just—" She interrupted him with a calm gesture. "I understand your anger. But at the time, I was also broken. When I found out that the IVF had worked, I panicked. I was alone, scared. But at the same time, it was everything I had ever dreamed of. All I could think about were the babies. Protecting them. Doing my best. I didn't want to depend on anyone else to make this dream come true." Her words hit me hard. Eduardo couldn't completely blame her, because deep down, he knew that he was the one who had walked away first. He was the one who had sunk into silence, frustration, denial. And she just kept going with what little hope she had left. "And the third boy?" he asked, trying to compose himself. "Is he mine too?" Clara smiled slightly, with tenderness in her eyes. "Samuel, no. He's adopted. He came into my life like an unexpected gift. So small, so fragile. I couldn't let him go. And his brothers accepted him as if he had been born with them. He is my son of the heart." Eduardo nodded, his eyes welling up. He felt a mixture of admiration and sadness. Clara, even alone, even afraid, had built what they had dreamed of together. Only now, he was a stranger coming through the door after the house was already finished. "Did you do it all by yourself?" he dared to ask, fearing the answer. She looked at the cup, thoughtful. "I had help from friends, from the hospital where I work, but yes, most of the time, it was just me. It was hard, Eduardo. Very hard. But I would do it all over again." The words got stuck in his throat. He wanted to say 1,000 things, but none of them seemed enough. All he could think about was how life had taken too many turns. And now here he was in front of the children he had loved so much but had never seen grow up. "I want to meet them," he said, his voice low but firm. "I don't know how, or if I'll know how to do it right. But I have to try." Clara looked at him for a few seconds. There was weariness on her face, but there was also cautious hope. "This won't be easy, but if it's for their own good, we can take it one step at a time." And there, between two almost empty cups, a new chapter began to open. A few days after that intense conversation, Clara sent a simple message. "Caio and Davi will be at home tomorrow night. If you want, you can come by after 7 p.m. Eduardo stared at his cell phone for a few minutes, feeling butterflies in his stomach that he hadn't felt since he was a teenager. This wouldn't be just any visit. It was a reunion with a part of him that he didn't even know existed. The next night, he parked his car slowly on the cobblestone street in front of the modest house where Clara lived with her children. The facade needed paint, there were some cracks in the wall, but the lights on and the plants in the window gave the place a welcoming feel. He took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. It was Samuel who answered the door, with a wide smile and a t-shirt with a dinosaur drawing. "Your Uncle Edu, right?" he asked with curiosity in his eyes. Eduardo smiled, trying not to get emotional about the title. "Yes, I am. And you must be Samuel." The boy nodded, holding the door open as he shouted, "Mom, he's here." Clara appeared soon after, with her hair tied up and an apron stained with sauce. "Come in." They're in the living room. The house was simple, but full of details that showed life. Drawings stuck to the fridge, toys in the corner of the room, school books spread out on the table. You could feel that there was effort there, but also a lot of love. Caio and Davi were on the couch, playing video games. When they saw Eduardo, they stopped for a second. Silence fell. There was no hostility, but it was clear that they were trying to understand who this man was, and why he was there. "Hi, boys," Eduardo said with a shy smile. "I'm Eduardo. I know it's a little strange for me to be here like this, out of nowhere, but your mom thought it would be nice for us to meet." Davi just nodded, looking sideways. Caio gripped the remote tightly and said in a dry tone, "Are you the father?" Eduardo was taken aback by the direct question. He looked at Clara, who just nodded subtly, as if to say, "You need to say it." "Yes, I'm your father. But I haven't been here before, and I'm sorry about that. Really sorry." Silence returned for a moment. But Samuel, with his easygoing manner, ran to the kitchen and shouted, "Mom, is dinner ready?" Clara smiled, relieved by that break in tension. "Yes, it is. Shall we eat?" During dinner, the conversation was shy. Eduardo tried not to force anything. He asked simple questions, if they liked school, soccer, what they liked to do on the weekends. Samuel talked a lot. Davi said a word or two, and Caio, although silent, no longer kept his gaze so distant. After dessert, Clara went to put Samuel to bed, and Eduardo helped set the table. While washing the dishes in the sink, she heard footsteps behind her. It was Davi. "Do you know how to do fractions?" he asked, holding a notebook. Eduardo dried his hands and smiled. "Yes, I do. Do you want help?" Davi nodded and pulled up a chair at the kitchen table. It was just a math exercise, but to Eduardo, it seemed like the beginning of something much bigger. A small step on the long road he knew he would have to travel. The following days were marked by small encounters. Eduardo would show up once or twice a week. Sometimes he would have dinner with them. Other times he would just help with their homework or sit in the living room listening to Samuel tell crazy stories about monsters and space heroes. It wasn't easy. Everything was new and strange. But little by little, the boys seemed to get used to his presence. Davi was more open. He liked to ask questions, especially when Clara wasn't around. Caio, on the other hand, was quieter, always observing, as if he was trying to understand who exactly this man was who had appeared out of nowhere, wanting to be part of their lives. It was one rainy night that everything changed. The power went out and the house went silent. Clara put candles in the kitchen, and the three boys settled down in the living room. Eduardo took the opportunity to joke. "This looks like camping, huh?" Samuel laughed, and Davi agreed. Caio, as usual, remained silent. But something in that more intimate atmosphere seemed to open up a gap. "Mom, she's taking a shower," Davi said, adjusting the cushion on the couch. "Can we talk?" Eduardo felt a shiver run down his spine. "Sure, whatever you want." The two teenagers exchanged a quick glance. It was as if they had already arranged this beforehand. "We already know, okay?" Davi began. "About you being our father." Caio continued. "We didn't really understand at first. And, to be honest, we were angry. Mama's always been everything to us. She never complained about anything, even when money was tight or when we were sick." Eduardo nodded, feeling his heart tighten. "I understand, Caio. You have every right to feel that way. I failed you, and I'm not going to try to justify it. But we talked," Davi continued, "and we decided that maybe we can give it a chance." Caio took a deep breath, getting the weight off his chest. "We don't know if we'll make it okay. But if it's slow, without pressure, we could try." Eduardo could barely contain his emotion. His eyes filled with tears, but he smiled. "I expected nothing less than this. Thank you, really. I just want to be present, even if it's little by little, even if it takes time." Davi approached and patted him on the shoulder twice, a little awkwardly. "So, everything's okay." Caio didn't say anything else, but for the first time, he smiled slightly. At that moment, Eduardo felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: belonging. Not like before, when he imagined children still in their cribs, running around the house, but like now, with teenagers full of doubts and emotions who decided to give him a second chance. The lost time would not come back, but perhaps whatever came from now on could be even more valuable. The following weeks passed in a flash. Eduardo was no longer just a polite visitor. He was starting to become part of the routine, albeit in a discreet way. Sometimes he would pick up the boys from school. Other times he would help with their homework or bring them pizzas on Saturdays. Nothing was forced. Everything was based on, "Can I help? Do you want me to stay? Is it okay if I come by later?" And little by little, the doors started to open. Samuel was the first to call him Dad without realizing it. They were playing in the backyard, he and Eduardo building a little hut with old sheets and kitchen chairs. When Clara went out to get some juice, Samuel pointed at the makeshift house and shouted, "Look, Mom, Dad, and I made a fort." Eduardo froze for a second. Clara did too, but no one said anything. She just smiled slightly and went back in, while he remained there with a lump in his throat and his heart bursting from the inside out. Davi and Caio still didn't call Eduardo Dad, but they were already treating him naturally. They had gotten past the stage of distrust. Now they laughed with him, discussed soccer, and talked about school plans. Eduardo noticed that the wall between them was getting smaller, albeit slowly. One Sunday afternoon, while they were playing soccer in the backyard, Eduardo made a perfect pass to Davi, who dribbled past Caio and kicked the ball toward the goal, marked by 2 rocks. The ball went in. Davi celebrated, raising his arms. "Good one, Dad," he shouted, laughing. Silence. He realized what he had said and quickly glanced at Caio, who just smiled and shrugged. Eduardo swallowed his tears. That was the kind of victory that didn't make the papers, but meant the whole world. Later, Clara called him a talk. "They're fine with you," she said, sitting on the couch while making coffee. "I can see that, and that puts me at peace." Eduardo smiled, his eyes welling up. "Thank you for letting me try. I know you could have gone on with your life without ever looking for me, and yet you gave me this chance." Clara looked at him, serious but calm. "I didn't do it for you. I did it for them. But I confess that it was good for me too, seeing you together, seeing you trying. Time, after all, doesn't erase everything, but can redesign history. Not like a forgotten draft, but like a new page, written with more care, more truth." In the last scene of this new phase, Eduardo was sitting on the bench in that same park where everything had started again. Davi was by his side, reading in silence. Caio was kicking the ball with Samuel near the running track, and Clara, from afar, watched the four of them with a slight smile on her face. Eduardo looked around and thought, I lost a lot, but I can still experience everything that matters. And this time he was there, present, with an open heart.